Good morning, everyone. Some of you may have seen the news about the Munich Security Conference over the last 2 days. It's a testimony to my love for DLD and for Steffi and for this wonderful community that I have persuaded the press to stop asking me questions for the next 17 minutes, which I'm now allowed to spend with you on global security and the environment. I, as Steffi has said, have two superstars with me. What she didn't mention is that this gentleman is actually a former head of the defense forces in the Netherlands, a general. We decided not to put on his uniform to not scare you off. And the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, a great partner of the Munich Security Conference, is the world's leading authority on climate security research. So we are having a star-studded panel for 15 minutes and 41 seconds. Listen, Tom, what's a general like you doing in a place like this?
Well, that's the first question I always get. And I have to be honest, climate was never on the forefront of my mind as a military. But my eye-opening moment was when I was a commander in the south of Afghanistan. And we were fighting for days to free a district center from Taliban. In the end, we succeeded, but only to find out that all the tensions were still there and that the Taliban could return any moment. And it took a while before we realized that the source of those tensions was all about water scarcity. It's an agricultural country, all farmers, they need water, there wasn't enough water, so that gave tensions. And the Taliban used that to gain leverage over the local population. And once we realized that, we were able to negotiate a solution in how to divide the water. Then it became stable. And a year later, I could walk through the main street of that city with our current king, showing the enormous turnaround. Not because of the fighting we did, but because we were able to address a root cause of the frictions. And that root cause was all about water scarcity and how that affected their lives. And for me, that was an eye-opening moment. And I saw that in other missions as well. I saw in Iraq how water was being weaponized by Daesh when they occupied the Mosul Dam. I saw in Somalia how poor farmers couldn't earn a living anymore on their lands and were pushed into the hands of piracy or Al-Shabaab. And I saw that in many other countries in Northern Africa, how they are destabilizing and how it increases migration flows and extremism in many ways just because of a changing climate. And it's not the only factor, but it's kind of a risk multiplier, as the US call it. But there is also a bigger picture to this. If you look at the bigger picture, we have a growing world population, we have growing prosperity, so there is an increasing demand for space, for water, for food, for resources. On the other side, we have a decreasing availability of resources. So there is a growing global gap between demand and supply. And if history should learn us one thing, it's that shortages give frictions, and frictions give conflicts. So I'm very concerned about the pathway we are on now. It's a pathway towards more conflict. And that's coming from a general. And to me, it's very obvious that meeting this growing demand by increasing our production in the way we are producing now will only increase the problem, because then we will be depleting our resources more quickly. So we need to find a new way, a transition to a new way to meet that growing demand, which means that we need to invest on resource independency, reducing our dependence on resources by innovation and by other ways of living, as the case that has been made here previously. If we don't, we will run into more competition and more conflicts. And that's my biggest concern. To me, climate change and biodiversity is also a matter of national security. And I'm very concerned about the legacy that my generation leaves behind for my children and my grandchildren. And that's what drives me to be a climate general.
Perfect. Good consecutor. You know. We have two little advertising blocks in this panel, which lasts another 12 minutes. The first one is, there is a book called The Climate General. Go and buy it. It's absolutely fantastic. Second part of the advertorial, this report, The Environment of Peace, which was launched a little over a year ago, written by Florian. And let me just cite its first sentence. Indicators of insecurity are rising. while indicators of environmental integrity are sinking. This mix is toxic, profound, and damaging. And institutions with the power to find solutions, including governments, are waking up far too slowly. Wake us up quicker, Florian.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, and thank you for raising the report. If you Google Environment of Peace, you should find it. A really important report that was written not by me, by a number of experts together. It's a collaborative activity that we have conducted for over 2 years leading up to the publication before Stockholm plus 50. That was the 50th anniversary after the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. The interesting thing and devastating thing that this report shows is how deeply interconnected the environment, nature, and the security space are. And that is something that is really problematic. And we know now from the climate space for so long, and Tom, you mentioned from your own experience. First of all, let me say that the working with the military on these issues sometimes is not only interesting, but also sometimes really refreshing, because the time frame that you're having to looking at these issues is very different from the typical policymaker that I interact with, which is 1 to 2 years or an election circle. The military looks 30 years ahead, right? And that is something really unique and really important that we need to do. From the research, we know climate change increases the risk of conflict and insecurity. And I mean insecurity and conflict here on a broad spectrum, from, in the extreme cases, contributing to violence and armed actors, armed conflicts. And the same we see, while research on biodiversity loss and security is still in its infancy, we're seeing the same indicators that are ringing alarm bells. We heard that over the last 2 days, several of those indicators, and for me the most important one is the impact on livelihoods. It came up in several of the discussions today and yesterday. If you only go a little bit south of here, we have a wonderful nature, the Alps, right? But a lot of times we go there for recreational purposes. We're forgetting that's a livelihood for so many peoples, for such a long history and such a long time. Climate change and environmental degradation are threatening that livelihood. Now, take us leaving Germany and Austria behind and going to Somalia, South Sudan, Afghanistan, where this biodiversity loss, environmental degradation, climate impact are compounded by governance challenges, by conflicts that are ongoing for, in some cases, more than 30 years. We are facing a tremendous challenge. It's the food security issues, it's a risk of political grievances, marginalization, and by that extension, the risk of increasing. All of these are indicators that are linked to the risk of violence. The second link, and that is a little bit of the flip side here, is the impact that war and conflict has on the environment. And that is something we often forget, but something we see so vividly in cases like Ukraine and Gaza at the very moment. Till today, you can trace the front lines of World War I by the amount of copper in the soil, right? It is a legacy that war leaves on the environment that spans multiple centuries. And the important part here is, and with that I'll stop, is we
still have 7
minutes,
28 seconds.
The important part is we can't do the same mistakes that we did with climate and security. We have been debating meticulously causality for 20 years, instead of recognizing 20 years ago that the risk is very clear and that we need to act. If we wait for facts and proof that climate change or biodiversity loss causes conflict and causes insecurity, we are too late.
Thank you. You're definitely not too late. Listen, you know, in the report there is one good example, many good examples, but one that I keep using when confronting your colleagues that aren't quite as much of a climate general or heads of intelligence agencies that criticize the Munich Security Conference for talking about soft things like climate, or even softer, perceived softer things like bees and birds. And it's the example about the water temperature in front of the Horn of Africa. And that really drives the point home. The water temperature around the Horn of Africa has risen by something like 2.4 degrees on average over the last 30 years. That means the fish need to swim further down. That means that poor Somali fishermen can't reach them anymore with the things that they have. That means they need to turn to other sources of feeding their families. That means they're left with piracy and crime. That means war, impact on supply chains, etc., etc. That's usually when people wake up. But in addition to examples like that, Tom, what can we do to get going? I mean, we're preaching to the converted here, but our crowd, what else can we do?
Well, I think it's good that the discussion is shifting towards solutions and policies. Too long we have been discussing the problem, and we all know there is a problem, so let's shift to dealing with it. And I think the military needs to be part of that team, needs to be part of the solution. It's a whole of government kind of problem, so you need all the departments in the government to deal with it, including the military, because it's also a security problem. And what the military can do, obviously, when there are natural disasters, they have a big organization, they can come for help, and they always do. And that will only increase in the future, because every year we see new records on natural disasters. A second thing they can do is help forecasting. It's very important to see it coming, to not react and respond to the effects of a changing climate, but to get ahead of the game. And the military intelligence services, you just mentioned them, they look at the fragile regions around Europe, and these regions are the regions that are mostly affected by a changing climate. So we look at the same regions, and if we identify climate change as a risk multiplier, it makes sense to me that you integrate climate factors into your intelligence assessments, so that you can predict where will climate change lead to migration flows, where will it lead to piracy, where will it lead to supply chain disruptions. And the more you can predict, the more you can get ahead of the game and be more proactive instead of reactive, which we are often now. The third element would be on mitigation. The military, and I'm a bit embarrassed to say that, is the biggest polluter in any country. So they have a responsibility when it comes to reducing emissions. Of course, you need to do that in a way that it does not affect their effectiveness, which calls for innovation. And this is a new cooperation area where the military can learn from civil innovations that are going on the whole energy transition, and translate that into the military environment. And they can be kind of a test bed for all kinds of innovations. And a fourth element where the military can be of help is on adaptation. Adaptation is especially needed in fragile regions around us. These regions are often also very insecure regions. So you need to integrate the security element into your adaptation programs. And I think the military can help there as well. But the most striking example to me is on innovation. The military has always been, or often been, in the lead for new innovation. The GPS, internet, microwave, it all came from the military. So I think we can be a platform for innovation. I'll give you one example. I was in a conference like this.
There is no conference like this.
Not as fast, no. Not as interesting as this, but I was approached by an artist. And he made sculptures. And he said to me, General, these are all very nice stories, but I have the solution for the world water problem. I can produce water from desert air. And he kept on talking for 10 minutes, and I wanted to congratulate him and move on, but then I thought, well, what if this works? What if this? We now have to supply our troops with millions of bottles of water to dangerous areas. It's a huge logistical challenge, and we create plastic waste mountains. And these areas already have water shortages. So what if you can use innovations like that to help solve the problem? So I gave him a chance. I gave him a chance to test this device in Mali, in the camp we had in the desert. And he was able to produce water with but only one glass per day. We kept on helping him, and he improved that. And in the end, he was able to produce, with a small device on a solar panel, self-sufficient, 20 to 30 liters of water per day. And now it becomes interesting, because then you can support a whole family in the Sahel region. And that family does not have to migrate, does not have to move away, does not have to look for alternatives. So innovation can be a huge part of the solution. And in the World Expo in Dubai, he made a bigger device that produced 1,000 liters of water per day. And that can sustain a whole farm or a village. So I think a large part of the solution is in innovation, and I think the military can support that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Same question very quickly to you. I think we get 2 extra minutes because you took 2 away from us at the beginning. Same question to you, but could you also remind the audience or talk about something that you've said in our preparatory call, that we must not make the same mistake in the biodiversity debate that we've made in the climate debate?
Yeah. I think it's exactly the point around innovation, right? One of the issues we had when we wrote this report, which was an international advisory board led by Margot Wallström, who was a former Swedish foreign minister, EU commissioner, and Johan Rockström was on the board as well. And we always got this question, give us the positive examples. And we're like, we have a really hard time to finding them. And part of the problem is because nobody invests into new, innovative approaches without proof that they work. We heard this morning, like, what was it, less than 1% investment in innovation, right? That is the flip side. We need to turn it around. And I think the security framing is actually an opportunity here. We can use the security framing. We shouldn't be afraid of militarization here. It's an all-hands-on-deck approach, right? And we see that in the European Commission. The European Commission published a joint communication 2 years ago, I think it was now, which brings the defense, the diplomacy, and the development side together. Because we need all of those actors. That's a security space. That's a reality of the world we live in today, right? And that is what we need to do. And the last point, we need to see the flip side of security, and that's peace, right? And I think that is an important element where we are a peace research institute. We want to study innovative approaches that are peace enhancing, right? That is the holy grail that we are after. The minimum is do no harm, but the real opportunity is how can my intervention on conservation, on biodiversity increase, on sustainable farming practices, how can that contribute to peace in the long run?
We would have had so many other things to discuss. We would have been able to talk about, does the securitization of this topic actually help the debate or not? We'll do that next time. Thanks for having us. Thanks to my 2 panelists. Enjoy the rest of DLD.